It was a humid July evening in 1913, in the modest parlor of a small house in St. Louis, Missouri. The glow of a kerosene lamp flickered on patterned wallpaper, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Pearl Curran, a 30-year-old housewife with a gentle but guarded demeanor, sat across from her friend Emily Hutchings. The two had been experimenting with a Ouija board, a pastime that was beginning to lose its novelty for Pearl. She had no special interest in ghosts or spirits, no craving for occult thrills. In fact, she was bored. Emily, however, persisted. She guided Pearl's fingers over the wooden planchette, hoping for something, anything, beyond the usual disjointed words and meaningless strings of letters they had received before. Then, without warning, the planchette seemed to gain its own momentum. Slowly, deliberately, it spelled out, "Many moons ago I lived, again I come. Patience worth my name." Pearl stiffened. The phrasing was odd, and the name itself, Patience Worth, carried an archaic weight, as if it belonged in an English parish register from centuries past. Emily looked up at her, eyes wide. Something had shifted in the room. The air felt denser, charged with a strange gravity that made every sound sharper, every shadow deeper. Over the following weeks, Pearl, who had never been known for unusual vocabulary or literary ambition, began to relay longer and more elaborate messages from this mysterious voice. At first, they came through the Ouija board. Quaint phrases, moral reflections, snippets of poetry. But soon the voice of Patience Worth seemed to bypass the board entirely. Words would pour directly into Pearl's mind, emerging in a style foreign to her own, thick with Elizabethan turns of phrase and Anglo-Saxon cadence. Friends and curious neighbors were invited to witness. They gathered in Pearl's parlor, expecting perhaps a parlor trick or an indulgence in the supernatural fad of the era. What they heard instead was unsettling. Vivid narratives set in distant centuries, poems that carried a haunting rhythm, and conversations with an unseen personality who was witty, stubborn, and unshakably self-assured. When asked who she was, Patience Worth's story never wavered. She claimed to have lived in England in the 1600s, to have journeyed across the sea to the New World, and to have met her death there. She spoke with the confidence of someone recalling first-hand experience, yet she refused to give precise dates or locations that could verify her tale. The mystery was deepened, not clarified. By the end of that year, Pearl's life had changed irrevocably. The woman who once spent her afternoons tending the house and playing the piano now found herself the mouthpiece for a torrent of words she could barely keep up with. Those present during the sessions described the flow as relentless. Patience would dictate page after page without pause, her sentences already fully formed, her vocabulary both archaic and exact. Skeptics argued that Pearl was subconsciously crafting the material, perhaps drawing from half-remembered readings or an unrecognized well of creative talent. But others pointed to the sheer volume and speed of the dictation, the linguistic quirks, and the sustained character of Patience Worth as something far beyond ordinary imagination. In that warm summer of 1913, no one could have predicted that this unlikely partnership between a St. Louis housewife and a voice from the shadows would produce millions of words over the next 2 decades. Nor could they have known how fiercely the case would divide opinion between those who saw in Patience Worth proof of the survival of the soul and those who saw only the astonishing labyrinthine depths of the human mind. And yet, for Pearl, there was no division. Patience Worth was real. She was as present as the lamp on the table, as the scent of the lilacs in the garden. Whether spirit or secret self, she had arrived, and she intended to be heard. By 1914, what had begun as an idle curiosity had transformed into a full-scale literary phenomenon. The words of Patience Worth no longer needed the slow, awkward movement of the Ouija board. Instead, they flowed directly from Pearl's lips or fingertips, as if she were merely a secretary taking dictation from an unseen employer. Sitting in her modest parlor, she could produce page after page without hesitation, each sentence already polished, each image vivid. Those who attended the sessions described a strange duality. Pearl would sit with her typewriter or pad of paper, her expression calm, even detached, while her hands worked with uncanny speed. Sometimes she would speak aloud, and an assistant, often her friend Emily Hutchings, would scribble the words down. Other times, she would type at a pace that left onlookers shaking their heads. There were no rewrites, no pauses to search for the right phrase. The words seemed to arrive whole, with their rhythm and structure intact. The style itself was a curiosity. Patience spoke in a dialect that blended Elizabethan English with Anglo-Saxon roots, peppered with idioms no one present had ever heard in modern conversation. Scholars who later examined the text noted the peculiar authenticity of certain phrases, while also detecting an occasional anachronism, a word or construction that did not belong strictly to the 17th century. It was this blend of precision and imperfection that made the mystery deeper. If Pearl was inventing it, she was doing so with a mastery that rivaled trained historians and linguists. The first public exposure came in 1915, when local journalists began reporting on the St. Louis poetess of the Ouija board. Soon after, Caspar S. Yost, an editor at the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, published Patience Worth, A Psychic Mystery, 1916, a book that documented the phenomenon in meticulous detail without offering a definitive explanation. In his account, Yost described Pearl as a woman of ordinary background, someone whose formal education had not equipped her to produce the sheer volume or style of work attributed to Patience. The publications began to multiply. In 1917 came The Sorry Tale, an epic narrative set in the time of Christ, sprawling over hundreds of pages and filled with intricate characters, moral dilemmas, and the atmospheric weight of the ancient world. The following year, Hope Trueblood appeared, a tale of innocence and betrayal with the structure and emotional depth of a seasoned novelist's work. Alongside these novels came poetry, plays, and parables, a torrent of nearly 4 million words over the years. Public fascination reached its peak between 1916 and 1920. Newspapers across the United States ran features on the spirit author. Spiritualist groups hailed Patience Worth as proof of life after death, while literary critics debated whether the work stood on their own merit. Parapsychologists and skeptics alike traveled to St. Louis to observe Pearl at work. One of the most notable investigators was Dr. Walter Franklin Prince of the Boston Society for Psychical Research. Prince was no credulous mystic. He approached the case with the eye of a scholar, designing experiments to test Pearl's abilities. In one session, he asked her to compose a poem from Patience Worth, while simultaneously writing a personal letter in her own voice. To the astonishment of those present, she performed both tasks flawlessly. The poem complete in its imagery, the letter coherent and correctly phrased. Still, Prince stopped short of declaring the phenomenon proof of a spirit's existence. Instead, he left the case as an open question. Either the human mind was capable of far more than science had yet measured, or there was, in his words, some cause operating through Mrs. Curran, beyond the reach of ordinary explanation. The more the words flowed, the more the line blurred between Pearl Curran and Patience Worth. Friends noticed subtle changes in Pearl's speech and mannerisms, as if her own identity was being gradually shaped, or perhaps overshadowed, by that of her mysterious collaborator. The voice was no longer an occasional visitor. It had become a constant presence, as much a part of Pearl's life as the air she breathed. And yet, the question lingered. Was Patience Worth a ghost from the 17th century, or the flowering of an undiscovered genius hidden in the mind of a St. Louis housewife? The answer, if it existed, remained just beyond reach, carried in the current of words that seemed to have no end. By the 1920s, the name Patience Worth had become both a fascination and a puzzle for those who had followed her story from the beginning. The initial rush of public curiosity began to cool, replaced by more specialized interest from spiritualist circles, literary societies, and a handful of dedicated researchers. Pearl Curran continued her sessions faithfully, producing novels, plays, and countless poems. Yet the sensation of the early years was fading into the quieter persistence of a mystery that refused to resolve itself. The world outside her parlor was changing. The First World War had ended, the Roaring Twenties were in full swing, and modernist literature was reshaping the cultural landscape. While the works of Patience Worth still found appreciative readers, they now existed alongside the bold experiments of a new literary generation. Voices who courted controversy, embraced abstraction, and defied tradition. Patience, by contrast, remained anchored in a moral and stylistic sensibility that belonged to another age. Pearl herself began to feel the strain of living with two identities. She was still a wife, a hostess, a woman moving through the social fabric of St. Louis, yet she was also the living conduit for a voice that demanded hours of her time and all the energy her mind could muster. Some friends noticed that she seemed more withdrawn when she was not working with Patience, as if part of her was always listening for the next sentence, the next image. In 1927, Dr. Walter Franklin Prince published his monumental study, The Case of Patience Worth. It was the most exhaustive examination the phenomenon had ever received, detailing the experiments, the writings, and the testimony of those who had witnessed Pearl's sessions. Prince did not claim to have proven the existence of Patience Worth, but neither did he dismiss her. His conclusion was deliberately unsettling. Either Pearl's subconscious mind was capable of a literary feat beyond any documented precedent, or something, or someone, beyond herself, was speaking through her. The 1930s brought hardship. The Great Depression affected book sales and diminished public interest in unusual literary figures. Pearl's health began to decline, but she continued to write, to channel, to listen. Patience Worth's voice never faltered, never aged, never lost its authority. In 1937, Pearl Curran died at the age of 54, her final years marked by financial difficulty and the quiet companionship of the voice that had defined her adult life. After Pearl's death, the mystery did not vanish, but it retreated into the realm of historical curiosity. Scholars still debate the origin of Patience Worth's works. Skeptics point to the psychological phenomenon of cryptomnesia, the unconscious recollection of forgotten material, as a possible explanation. Spiritualists continue to see in her words the unmistakable proof of consciousness surviving death. For literary historians, The case remains a rare, confounding example of sustained high-level creativity emerging under circumstances that resist easy classification. Today, the legacy of Patience Worth lives on in the millions of words she dictated and in the questions those words inspire. Was she truly a woman from 17th century England, reaching across the veil to tell her stories? Or was she the hidden genius of Pearl Curran's mind, given a name and a voice to escape the constraints of an ordinary life? In the dimly lit parlor of that St. Louis home in 1913, when the planchette first spelled out, "Patience Worth my name," a seed was planted, one that would grow into an enduring enigma. Whether born of the spirit world or the secret chambers of the human mind, the voice of Patience Worth remains, even now, an echo that refuses to fade. It is the whisper of a life remembered, or perhaps imagined, that still asks us to listen.